Hey everyone, my name is Marshall Kozloff. I'm a senior fellow at the Niskanen Center, the host of the Realignment podcast at Niskanen, and the MC of today's and tomorrow's events. I'm going to do a couple things as MC. I'm going to introduce panels, give a set of opening remarks in terms of what we're going to be focusing on the next 2 days, and then also really introduce and contextualize the different threads and stories and personalities and institutions that we're going to feature over the course of the conference. So a quick shout out. I'm not going to read every single one of them out aloud, but I trust that y'all can do that on your own. Huge shout out to the co-hosts and the sponsors of this week's conference. They've done an incredible amount of work. They all do, at an individual level, incredible work. So I'd really suggest that if you get the chance to say hello, if there's any areas of interest or focus that you'd like to really dive in on, please feel free to reach out to folks accordingly. So a couple notes as we dive in here. So number one, we're doing a quick schedule change that folks may not have noticed. We're going to, rather than have me introduce Jen Pauka and Zach Graves, the co-chairs, we're going to go immediately from my set of remarks to the Build America Caucus events. There's obviously congressional business going on, so we're going to need to move the schedule around accordingly, but everything else is on the run for the rest of the day. So this is the second iteration of the Abundance Conference. Last year, we did this around the same time over at the other end of DC. And what's really exciting about this is literally 2 times as big as it was last time. And we have literally hundreds of people sitting on the wait list. So clearly there's energy, there's interest. People are here because they want to be here. And I think that really helps us understand kind of the differences in this political and policy moment that are really important to note. So last year, Abundance came, as a conference 6 months before Derek and Ezra's book, Abundance, came out. So at that point, we had a bunch of organizations, especially Inclusive Abundance. I want to do a particular shout out to them and Derek Kaufman's work. They put together this first iteration of the conference. And we were basically trying to tell people, hey, there's this new thing. It's called Abundance. The book isn't out yet. You may have heard of some of the work. There's excellent work that's adjacent, like Jen Pauka's Recoding America, but it's a little different, so it's kind of vague. We were kind of just throwing out there the idea that there was this new frame for understanding America's political and policy challenges, and that was really exciting from the perspective of getting 250 people interested. But now that we're sitting in the wake of the 2024 election, now that we're sitting in the wake of the release of Abundance back in March, and I think critically this really needs to be emphasized, we're also sitting in the wake of really excellent books that have built the space out beyond just Abundance. So I want to do particular shout outs to the following authors who are going to actually be speaking at this conference, who are really building this into a broad project and hitting this from different ideological and political backgrounds. So specifically, Yoni Applebaum's Stuck. Incredible book, really gets at the lack of dynamism in America right now. We then, of course, have Mark Duckelman, my Niskanen colleagues, Why Nothing Works, which really tells the story of post-1970s American politics from the framework of understanding how exactly we got to the point where there could be this big set of cross-ideological people interested in this question. And last but not least, the most recent release in this sort of trilogy, if you will, would be Dan Wong's Breakneck, came out a little more than a week ago, really contextualizes these abundance and building conversations in the context of the US and the world, and once again, like what's broadly happening here as a country. As I think about sort of the differences between these 2 iterations of the conference, Conference 1 was really about introducing the idea. I think from a mission perspective that each and every one of us can really take to account as we move forward, I would sort of say the objective that I have, that I think we could all unite around, is the idea that this conference, this work, the organizations who are participating, have a real serious need to basically prove in the next year that this isn't just a fad, that this isn't just the sort of book of the month you reference when you're trying to sound smart at a cocktail party. After elections, there's usually a book that sort of captures the moment and gets a lot of attention. So in 2004, you had What's the Matter of Kansas with Thomas Frank. In 2016, everyone read Hillbilly Elegy. And I think if you look at both of those books, They obviously, I think, are interesting books, and they had a lot to contribute to the discourse. But in terms of looking out a year beyond their publication and them sort of failing, I think, to sort of galvanize and build something substantive, I think abundance, because of the fact that we have all of the people here, we have all these different organizations that are present, we have the chance to really, for the next year, prove that this isn't just the convenient thing, this isn't just sort of the faddish term, like this is actually a big central new idea when people clearly at all levels, whether you're a pundit at the New York Times or you're just a voter or someone who's looking to actually organize and contribute, there's a real opportunity for something to be built here. So I think what we can do as we think about next year and as we think about what's actually occurring during this actual event over the next 2 days is really ask ourselves, like, what are we substantively building? What are we producing from this? And what's actually going to sort of offer us for next year or whatever different iterations of this conference, of this broad community we're building, what can we actually say came out of this that's going to stand the test of time and not just be a post-2024 election sort of take in that sense. So I'd say the next thing that I really want to talk about, something that a lot of people I'm sure are talking about internally and externally, this is very much in the X discourse, is like the wide variety of different ideological factions and institutions. There's lots of people who I would say wouldn't typically find themselves either on a conference panel, at the same table, or in the same workshop. I think what's so fascinating about abundance, and something that's going to occur a little later today, my Niskanen colleague Steve Tellys has an excellent new paper out. It's called Varieties of Abundance. And it really gets at one of the challenges that we kind of have here, both at a movement level and, frankly, from a conference programming. How do we be friends? We're also acknowledging we have differences perspective. And the central idea that Steve puts forth, I don't want to crib too much from him, is just the idea that abundance doesn't just exist from the perspective of a political objective as just like one set movement with a set list of marching orders that everyone just perfectly agrees on. And in the paper, something that also was dunked on Twitter was his reference to the idea that abundance is not just left, right, and center. And I think people sort of took that a little too literally and sort of put that in the lens of sort of vapid DC bipartisanship centrism that doesn't really mean anything. The point of the sort of the idea that this conference has left, right, and center participants is that abundance from a goals perspective, from like acknowledging the idea that so many of America's problems are explained by the existence of these bottlenecks that limit our ability to supply and deliver the things that actually we want, those aren't going to traditionally fit into the typical sort of, are we going to expand the welfare state or are we going to reduce the size of government? It exists outside of those at a deep, deep policy level. So if you're really asking, like, why am I seated next to someone who's sort of like libertarian, even though I'm a progressive? If you're a centrist who's really interested in moderation, why am I hanging out with someone who voted for Donald Trump? I think, look, once again, the real makeup of this conference and its co-hosts illustrates the fact that there's an opportunity here to just build on this adjacent space that doesn't require us to say social issues don't matter or we're all just the same. We all just totally agree on everything. This just says this is a different space that we could build and do things in. A couple other things I want to shout and I want people to really think about. So I'm really fascinated as a person who podcasts, as a person who sort of engages in punditry. I'm interested in the fact that, you know, we as a country, we as a broad policy political community are kind of fighting over what different stories we want to tell about the country right now. I think there are a lot of people who are not friendly with the various organizations in this room and the various individuals in this room for a variety of reasons have a really valid critique when they point out that what these sort of spaces really struggle to do typically is just tell a coherent, clear, obvious story that resonates with actual people who don't just go to DC conferences, don't read think tank papers, don't engage in these sorts of debates. So really spending time acknowledging the really interesting opportunity that if we actually look at what unites the sort of left, right, and center groupings here, it's that we all basically agree that something went wrong in America in the 1970s. There are different causes, there are different parts of that stories you would emphasize, but critically, we all agree at a policy, at a political level, the type of leaders we elevated, the type of priorities we focused on as a country, the sort of problems we identified may have been proper at that time, but they are no longer coherent, obvious, or even helpful for people thinking about this current moment. So thinking through what story you would tell about what comes next out of this post-1970s moment is a really key opportunity that would also help help us ground our understanding of the fact that, once again, we don't have to agree on everything, but we can just agree that this idea of building more, of delivering, of making government actually function and achieve its goal is very, very, very critical. So last and not least, the most important shout I want to close with before we transition into the Build America Caucus panel is I really want to shout out the YIMBY movement. Obviously, when people sort of question, like, is abundance real? Is this dynamic? Is this a real thing? We should recognize we're building on the real, organic, democratic, inclusive work that the YIMBY movement has spent more than 10 years building. I think what's been so exciting about these... What's been so exciting about the YIMBY movement is really just the fact that they were the first political policy-oriented movement in a long time that really just brought in people who were just living in their communities and had actual problems. So as we expand the lens of abundance and the sort of issues we're facing and sort of the different conversations we could be having, if we could find ways to bring that spirit of democracy and inclusion and participation into our own work, I know that is the type of thing that will make this year over the sort of next 12 months actually mean something. So with that introduction, I'm very excited to introduce the first panel of today's conversations. I would love to welcome the Build America Caucus. We have Derek Kaufman of Inclusive Abundance. Once again, huge shout out to Derek for kicking this off last year. We have Representative Richie Torres, Representative Celeste Malloy, and Representative Josh Harder. So welcome them all to the stage, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Marshall. Good morning, everyone. How's it going? Welcome to day one of Abundance 2025. I'm Derek Kaufman, the founder and CEO of Inclusive Abundance. I want to start by asking, who was here at last year's inaugural Abundance Conference? Raise your hand. And now, for whom is this your first Abundance Conference? Raise your hand. It's amazing how much this movement has grown in a year. I'm so happy to be here today, surrounded by kindred spirits, finding common cause under this banner of abundance. For those of you who haven't heard of my organization, Inclusive Abundance, we've been working to operationalize the ideas so many of you have been developing in this room. Building more housing, investing in clean energy, encouraging innovation, and making government work better for everyone. When we launched last year's conference, in my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined where we'd be today. The release of Ezra and other Derek's book, the ensuing spirited discourse, has raised awareness of all the ways in which artificial scarcity is holding us back. To me, abundance offers an ambitious, optimistic vision for America, one that puts progress back at the root of progressivism, that embraces building in both our physical world and our key institutions, and most importantly, prioritizes getting stuff done. One that envisions government convincingly making a positive difference in people's lives where it can, and getting out of the way where it can't. A society where shared prosperity, inclusive abundance, helps us escape the limits of our polarized politics and end the vicious cycle of pessimism and divisiveness, restoring faith in our democracy and in our institutions. Since last October, these ideas have completely taken off. Look at this conference. I'm so proud that Inclusive Abundance is now just one of 15 co-hosts representing a vibrant, intellectually diverse, and rapidly growing movement. In May, we worked closely with Congressman Josh Harder and many of the partners in this room to support the launch of a new bipartisan congressional caucus, the Build America Caucus. There are 29 members from across the political spectrum working to advance policies that bring down costs, increase economic mobility, and strengthen our national security. Today, we're joined by 3 caucus members, Chair Harder and Congresspeople Celeste Malloy and Richie Torres. They're here before running over to the House to vote later this morning, so we'll keep things moving along. I also want to quickly shout out Congressman Jay Obernolte, who was supposed to be on the stage, but due to this last-minute scheduling shift, couldn't join us. We have Republicans and we have Democrats, and this is one of the things that I love about Abundance. It not only is giving us a concrete set of policies on infrastructure and innovation and government effectiveness, but it also offers an ideologically inclusive vision for how we can work together to build a better America. Inclusive Abundance is excited to continue to work with our partners to support the success of this caucus, and if any of you would like to help, please reach out to me or the team. And with that, let's get started. Congressman Harder, you founded the Build America Caucus only a few months ago, and it's already shown real bipartisan momentum on a whole variety of issues. What motivated you to launch the caucus, and what excites you most about the work over the months and years ahead?
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Derek, for your leadership, and to my fellow caucus members and all of you for being here. I think in some ways this is a caucus that could have and maybe should have been created many years ago, but the moment is coming to fruition right now. And I think the momentum has really just been building. This is a bipartisan effort that has members from some of the most progressive Democrats to some of the most conservative Republicans in caucus, united by a shared vision of what we can actually do to make sure that we are building the energy, the housing, the infrastructure better, faster, and cheaper. And I think really the moment of why now is because of two things. A real deep shared frustration that all of our caucus members have with how policy has been implemented over the last decade or so especially, where we've taken a lot of tough votes and we haven't really seen the results in the communities that we represent. We've seen, I think, real failures like high-speed rail in my home state of California. We've seen some of the challenges with the infrastructure bill that we passed a couple years ago, the Inflation Reduction Act, and many more, where we just have not achieved the goals of this legislation that we've actually spent so much blood, sweat, and tears to get across the finish line. And then I think the other second point for why now is just that the political coalition is so much more mature. We've seen so much more activity at a state and local level on many of these issues, and it's past time that we see more federal leadership. Since we've launched 5 or 6 months ago, we've had a whole suite of bipartisan bills that have been launched from members in our caucus, including efforts like making geothermal permitting easier, thanks to Congresswoman Malloy and her tremendous efforts, making housing faster and cheaper, where we have a whole suite of bills, and I think this is probably the most advanced we've ever seen the housing movement in Congress, although there's still a lot more work to be done, and then a couple efforts on infrastructure, on innovation, on healthcare, and so there's been a whole host of efforts, and obviously a lot more work to go.
That's really exciting. Representative Malloy, energy abundance, and your governor has talked about this in Utah, with permitting and transmission reform is one of the main challenges that the caucus is hoping to tackle. What draws you to that issue, and how do you envision Republicans and Democrats in this environment working together to make some progress on that?
I'm drawn to the issue, I guess, organically. I come by it naturally. I used to be a real lawyer, and I used to work for one of the fastest growing counties in the United States, Washington County in southern Utah. And I spent a lot of my time just working on getting permits for projects that were not controversial, that were essential, and we had widespread buy-in. We knew what we needed to do, but the process has become problematic. And a lot of these things started from a good place. You know, we love, on my side of the aisle, to rail against NEPA now, but NEPA was just supposed to be, before you build a project, look at the alternatives and make sure that you've thought through whether this is the best one. Now it's become a gift to trial lawyers and the gum that gums up the works. And we actually do need to be able to build things and do things in this country. And I think we've reached the point where there's widespread agreement on that. So the reason I'm drawn to it is because I represent a district in Utah. I represent the whole West Desert in Utah, and we have resources. We're doing geothermal research there. We have a lot of space. We have a lot of power lines that go through. We also have a lot of public land. And in order for local governments to do anything, they've got to go through these federal processes that take years. And I have a lot of communities in my district that are very small and not wealthy. You know, they're really restricted financially. And we're making the projects that they have to do, providing clean, safe drinking water, providing streets and roads and power, much more expensive than it needs to be just because of the process. And I think that's the scarcity mindset that everybody's talking about. You know, if everybody doesn't have their finger in the pie, then something's going to go wrong because we don't trust each other. We don't believe that people are going to look at the alternatives and make a good decision. And I think it's time to peel a lot of that back. So because of the district I represent and the experiences that I've had in my professional life, I know that we have to be able to streamline a lot of these processes, but in a way that people can trust. I say all the time, we can make good environmental decisions a lot faster and a lot cheaper than we're making them. But in the past, a lot of times the debate has been, if we look at regulation, if we look at streamlining regulation at all, we're going to endanger the environment. But we have 2-3 generations now of environmental awareness under our belt. I think we can do it. I think we can do it quickly. I think we can do it with a lot less cost, and then we can get more projects done if we're not eating up all of our capital just in the process. So now I've kind of strayed off of what you were asking, but
It's okay, I love it, and
that's why I'm here.
thank you. And time is money, right? So when you make things go faster, then they become cheaper.
Yeah.
And you don't have to squeeze other dimensions if you can get the time dimension right. Congressman Torres, you've recognized the importance of building our next generation energy as fast as possible. After the Supreme Court's 7-county ruling, you wrote a letter to the White House and to New York's Governor Hochul to seize the opportunity to accelerate progress on these issues, even if that means challenging and potentially frustrating some traditional allies in the coalition. How do you think about navigating in kind of Democratic Party coalitional politics, kind of moving faster and balancing the environmental concerns and the need to build out clean energy quickly?
Sure. Look, for me, one of the cruelest ironies of our time has been the weaponization of environmental law against projects that are good for the environment. Like, far too often, the clean energy transition, which just about every Democrat cares about, has been a victim of bureaucracy and NIMBYism and litigiousness. And the reality is there's going to be no rapid electrification in America without permitting reform. The United States has to triple transmission infrastructure in order to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And from 2009 to 2025, China built around 25,000 miles of ultra-high voltage transmission. The United States built nothing because we have a patchwork permitting system where every state and locality has its own fiefdom, has veto power, and if everyone has veto power, nothing gets done. And I worry that it's going to have not only environmental implications, but strategic and security implications. I sit on the China committee, so I think about abundance through the prism of strategic competition. When it comes to new energy capacity, China's building the equivalent of a whole United States every 2 years. China's outbuilding the United States by a factor of 8 to 1. And so we have a stat, we as a party often preach clean energy abundance, but we're fundamentally failing to practice it. And China's building more, and it's largely on the strength of solar energy. China builds more solar energy than the United States and EU combined, than the G7 countries combined, than almost all of the 38 OECD countries combined. And so I worry that we have a status quo of self-inflicted scarcity that's fundamentally undermining our ability to transition to a clean energy economy and to prevail in the strategic competition with China, because the most critical input into an economy, the most critical input into an AI revolution is energy.
Yeah. I love it, and I think China has built more solar last year than the U.S. has built on the entire grid.
It's the solar
in our
superpower.
history.
It's the solar superpower of the world.
And 27 nuclear reactors under construction versus 0. So there's cost, as you talk about all the time, and there's national security, and abundance is an answer for both of those. I think it's great. A question for all of you. We talk a lot about building in the physical world. The first half of the book very much talks about that. But then there's the question about making government work better for people and ushering in a new era of scientific progress and technological innovation. How do you and how does the caucus think about these other challenges around innovation and government effectiveness, especially in this era where AI is advancing so rapidly? Take it in any order.
I'll jump in on the AI part quickly. I talk a lot about regulatory reform, and I think AI is the answer to a lot of the problems we've had. We haven't reformed our bureaucracy in a long time, and we have people doing jobs really inefficiently that AI could do very efficiently, and then the people could be out doing other things that are more innovative. When you are sorting through paperwork and checking boxes, that's probably not the best use of our human capital, but we have AI that can do that now very quickly, very efficiently, and That's part of the abundance mindset. We can unleash American workers, even American bureaucrats, to go get innovative, interact with people, help build up some of that trust that started to fall apart. There's a reason that the DMV is a punchline in every joke. Nobody wants to go stand in line at the DMV. And by the time you get to the window, they're not excited to see you either. And so it's not a nourishing human interaction for anybody. But if we had ways that you could put in your information and get your driver's license spit out quickly, and the people who were working at the DMV could have a nice day, and when they say have a nice day, you would actually believe them, that really changes the way we view our interactions with our own government, whether it be state, local, federal. If we could take some of the drudgery out of bureaucracy and take some of the friction points out of interaction, can you imagine what we could be innovating? Oh, that got a lot louder. The way China is. If we change the way we thought about some of these processes, and in the 1970s, when a lot of our environmental laws started, computers were still very new. The idea that a person sitting at a computer could do this work was innovative then, and we just haven't updated the way we think.
I think a lot of the discussions on scientific innovation over the last couple of months have been about the levels of spending that we're spending on the NIH, which is an important discussion, but a lot less thought has gone into just how gummed up our entire scientific process is, from the NIH and the NSF down through healthcare clinical trials. Yesterday, our caucus met with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who was one of the FDA commissioners in the first Trump administration, and talked about what we can do to make accelerating clinical trials happen. I don't think folks realize how quickly China has dominated the biopharma market over the last couple of years. Richie talked about solar. 75% of the new drug approvals in the United States last year were from China. 75%. They have just completely eclipsed us. And it's not that we are making these drugs any safer. It is just we are not actually discovering the new cures for cancer and Alzheimer's at the rate that we have. And AI is just going to accelerate drug discovery and make this bottleneck of process even more challenging. And so there's a lot of bipartisan will in our caucus to try to make sure that we are unleashing that innovation. I'll give you one simple example of a process that makes absolutely no sense. Right now, we require every drug being developed in the United States to prove that you can actually manufacture a drug at scale for millions and millions of people, regardless of how many folks are actually going to use it. And even before we know if the drug works, we require that. And that requires tiny startups, think of a professor in a lab trying to discover the next cure for cancer, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars of capital to prove that. And so if all we did is say, let's keep that regulation the same, but let's actually do that after we know if the drug works, we are saving tens of billions of dollars out of the biopharma market and help accelerating those cures and those discoveries that I think our country needs. So that's one example of one of the things we're doing to make sure that we're accelerating innovation in clinical trials.
Anything to say on that?
Just on the point about, there are those on the right for whom regulation can do no right. And there are those on the left for whom regulation can do no wrong. And for me, the abundance is about striking the balance. A wise person once said the difference between medicine and poison is dosage.
Yeah.
And I think we have to get the dosage of regulation right, embrace technologies and public policies that allow for more innovation. Because we do live in these two conflicting realities, right? The world of bits and the world of atoms. And in the world of bits is a world of abundance and affordability. But the world of atoms, the world of physical infrastructure, is one of cost, disease, and scarcity.
We live in a highly polarized environment, and I believe one of the promises of abundance is to unlock new kinds of coalitions. Online, there's a lot of rage and anger, and when you get members like you sitting here on a stage, there's incredibly thoughtful people who might have some differences of opinion of where that knob is on regulation, dosage, or government spending. But it feels like in a low-trust environment, it's hard to get the work done, especially when in public, there's just so much, party competition. So in a bipartisan caucus and just in your work, I'm curious, how can this community help provide events or provide venues to build that trust? How do you guys navigate across the aisle with your colleagues to think about how bipartisan bills come to life?
there's no Republican or Democratic way to fill a pothole. And I think one of the real promises of our caucus and of abundance in general is a much greater focus on the outcomes of our policies than the processes that those things actually have to go through. If you talk to any member of Congress, they want the same things for their community. They want better infrastructure, they want safer streets, they want cheaper energy and cheaper housing, probably more than anything right now. And so I think what our caucus is trying to do is trying to make sure that we are having that focus on the end result and then leading folks towards what it actually is going to take to get there. And that's what we've been able to get some success for over the last couple of months, and not spend as much time arguing about all the different hoops that you have to get through, and just saying, well, is this process working to deliver the results that our constituents sent us to Congress for? And the answer, almost universally, is no. So then let's see what we can do to fix it.
Yeah, there may not be a Republican or Democrat way to fill a pothole, but it does sound like the beginning of a good joke. Maybe an opener for a political event. But yeah, that's when I ran. I've only been in Congress less than 2 years. And when I ran, I spent a lot of time on the campaign trail during the first campaign, telling my constituents in very red Utah that we needed to adjust all of the bureaucracy, do some regulatory reform. And I would often be met with skepticism of, yeah, that we know that here, but when you get to Washington, D.C., you know, you're going to have to work with Democrats, and Democrats like bureaucracy. And I kept telling people, I think this is a bipartisan issue. I think, you know, when it comes to downtown infrastructure in an urban area or trying to build out infrastructure in a rural area, we're in the same place. And so it was really exciting to me when a Democrat colleague reached out to me soon after I got to Congress and asked me to join a caucus.
You told me you almost swore off the road and hit something. You were so surprised that
a
Democrat was asking you to cut regulations.
And so now I'm doing a victory lap around Utah telling everybody that a Democrat invited me to come be part of this. But I do think that's part of what's been broken for so long, is that ideologically, Democrats have traditionally assumed that the bureaucracy is here to keep us safe, and Republicans have assumed that the bureaucracy is here to rob us. And so we're just talking right past each other. And now that we are bringing people together and talking about how it's not working for anyone, I think we can admit that both sides have been a little bit blind on that. We are not fit to live in an unregulated world. You know, our great-grandparents may have grown a lot of their own food and taken risks, and, you know, maybe food poisoning was just a factored in thing. We expect when we buy something for it to work correctly, and we expect when we go to the store to have food that's healthy and safe, and we know exactly what's in it. And so we have to have regulation. I don't know that anybody's arguing against regulation anymore, but we have to have regulation that actually makes our lives better. And so those are the knobs we're turning. When is it too much, and when do we need to dial it back so that we have just enough government to make sure our lives work and that we can safely operate in a society full of people we don't know? And when does it get to be so much government that now it's getting in the way of us being able to operate in society? And now is the time to have that conversation. So the fact that people from different places are coming together, that this many people are sitting in a room willing to hear about this when I'm sure they're all busy and have places to be, gives me hope that we're actually headed there instead of it just being a talking point on the campaign trail.
Can I make one more point? One more point there is that, look, the political coalition to get some of this passed at a state and local level often looks very different. You can have, a whole bunch of Democrats working on this issue in California and still get something done in the state legislature. You can have, Republican city councils in some areas moving on this. The only political coalition to solve these problems at a federal level, I believe, is bipartisan. There's just no other way it's going to happen. And I think the reason you didn't see energy permitting taken seriously when Democrats had a trifecta is because there were too many sacred cows on the Democratic side. And that political coalition has to be including folks on both sides. There are, I would argue, people on both the Republican and the Democratic parties that have zero-sum mindsets and zero-growth mentalities. And so what we're trying to do with this caucus is uniting folks that believe in growth, that believe in making life cheaper and better for folks, And if this is actually going to pass, if we're going to get energy permitting done for real, if we're going to actually fix housing, the only durable political coalition to do this at a federal level has got to be bipartisan. And so that's what we're trying to build.
Yeah, not only does it have to be bipartisan to have the math to get it passed in the first place, but I explain this all the time when I'm at home. It has to be bipartisan for it to last more than 4 years. If you want to go to one extreme and then the other, do something on straight party lines. But if you want it to last beyond this Congress, beyond this administration, then you have to have people from the other side bought in so that they don't want to burn it down when they get the chance.
Amen.
I agree. I second.
The last question I'll ask. So abundance as a word and as an intellectual framework has some elements that it's kind of elitist, and it is not the word you necessarily go use to talk about it in your districts. And intellectual frameworks and political movements that have some elite participation can be very useful, but you all need to keep winning elections. You all spend the last month in your district. So when you're at home, how are you talking about the things to the voters and to your constituents that uses the abundance principles and these abundance ideas? But what are some of the words that have been working?
So I never use the word abundance in the South Bronx. That's
right.
Mario Cuomo once said you campaign in poetry but govern in prose, and for me abundance is more about the prose of governing than the poetry of campaigning. But a message, Build America message, a build housing message, like resonates powerfully in my district. I mean, the Bronx has been hit the hardest by the housing affordability crisis. Like, we are feeling and experiencing the severe shortage of affordable housing, particularly for the lowest income. 10% of the households in my district have eviction cases. The median income in the Bronx is less than a third of the income you need to afford the median rent in New York City. And in my district, I had a senior housing development that received 26,000 applications just for 84 units, like 300 applicants chasing after a single unit. And so for the Bronx, the housing affordability crisis, housing scarcity, it's not an abstraction. It's something that we're feeling and living every day. We feel like we're ground zero, and a build housing message would resonate powerfully.
Yeah, similarly, when I'm at home, I talk to people about the things they care about in vocabulary that we share. So I don't use the term abundance either. Well, maybe occasionally, but I use phrases like, liberty isn't a finite good. There's enough liberty to go around. And I talk to people, I have downtown Salt Lake, which is a more liberal area of the state, and then I also have the really hyper-rural, far-flung parts of the state. And I meet both of them where they are. When I'm in downtown Salt Lake, we talk about homelessness, and we talk about how to find ways to get people off the street and on their feet and living their lives. And when I'm in rural Utah, we talk about how to get people jobs and on their feet and living their lives. But in both places, what people want is to know that they can make an honest living, that they can afford their housing, they can send their kids to college or trade school or wherever they want to go, and that they're going to be able to retire someday. And that is abundance. But I don't have to say abundance to be able to talk to people about it. I just have to meet them where they are, hear what their concerns are, and then figure out what we can do to address it. And a lot of times, what we need to do to address it is nothing federal. Sometimes we need to just leave it to the local and state governments. And I think that's another thing that we have to be more careful about is sometimes, because everybody reads national news and they watch national news and they're on social media hearing about national issues, we want to create a national solution to every problem. And sometimes the solution is keep the federal government out of it and let state and local government handle problems. And so we have to meet people where they are and hear what their concerns are that way too. People who get into jobs that we're in, people who run for Congress, tend to be the kind of people who like to fix problems. They like to jump in and help. Sometimes we jump in when we shouldn't. And so there's that too. I don't have to talk about abundance, but sometimes we need a little bit of scarcity of federal government.
I think the fact is Americans are really pissed off. Pretty much the only thing that everybody can agree with across the country is that America's headed in the wrong direction. And people felt that during the Biden administration, and now they're still feeling it under the Trump administration. And I think we can argue about the reasons for that, but I think one of the biggest ones is that folks feel that life is just unaffordable everywhere, and that the basic necessities, the energy and the housing and the, everything that we pay for has just gotten unbelievably expensive. There's been a lot of great research on how to actually explain to folks that building more housing lowers prices, and there's a lot of challenges in how people think about that and all the rest. But I think that reality is the strongest antidote to that dissatisfaction. And if people are living in a community where housing prices are falling, or at least staying steady and not rising the way they have in the last couple of years, if they're in an area where they're paying for cheaper electricity, they will feel those results and they will recognize the folks that are responsible for doing that. But the opposite is also true. And that is the environment that we've been in. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons you've seen this ping pong effect for the last many years at a federal level, bouncing from Barack Obama to Donald Trump to Joe Biden back to Donald Trump. People are just really dissatisfied. And so I think one of the ways that we can talk to folks about this is the reason you're dissatisfied is not enough has been done to make your lives better. And that's exactly what we're trying to fix.
Thank you all so much. You're going to go run and get votes. I would just say, having members of Congress in person at Abundance to see the work that you guys are doing, the seriousness with which you're taking this issue, and really being the pointy end of the spear of so much of this movement has been thrilling, and I'm so grateful for what you do, and really excited to see both this caucus and in your individual offices the work that's ahead. So thank you, and thanks everyone for being here this morning.
Thank you. All right. Thanks.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.